tonight on First Tuesday.
There's people screaming and getting crushed, falling at your feet. And everyone was picking everybody up. You just couldn't understand what was happening.
The Hillsborough investigation. The inside story of Britain's worst ever football disaster. Good evening. How large does the writing on the wall have to be before they make football safe? As large as at Hillsborough, it would seem. The lives of 95 supporters of the best football in England. That's what it took to make the authorities listen to last week's stern conclusions from the Taylor report. Lord Justice Taylor allowed us to film the 9-month inquiry in our attempt to build up an exact picture of what happened on that day. We use police video footage seen only by the inquiry team, footage which may be upsetting, particularly for anyone immediately affected by the events. South Yorkshire Police, whose Chief Constable, Peter Wright, yesterday announced his retirement, were severely criticised by the judge. We were not given access to officers in command at the match, but from the lower ranks, commended by the judge, a sergeant tells us his story. So here is our account of Cup semi-final day 1989. A day of disaster at Hillsborough.
Just setting out for a football match, you would never expect something like that to happen. I suppose had it have been we were going to war, to fight a battle, you'd have expected casualties and fatalities, just not at a football match on a Saturday afternoon. No one could have been prepared for that. I think that's what shocked a lot of people.
The worst, and they are reluctant.
3 days after the worst football disaster in British history, a unique investigation began. For the first time, a public inquiry, chaired by a judge, would direct a police force to gather the evidence. The task, which fell to West Midlands Police, was to discover precisely what happened on that day at Hillsborough, which claimed the lives of 95 people. In Liverpool, the investigation is now underway. 120 West Midlands officers have set up their base here. Over the coming months, they will speak to thousands of witnesses.
Right, morning. Oh, thank you. Just one or two things I want to talk about to you this morning, all right? Just to let you know where we are. We're 7,385 nominals, names in the system. There's 1,433 statements being taken. Equates to something like a Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, which took 6 months, in a month. We're still getting priority actions of injured fans. Please treat them as priority because they come in priority number 1, as you know. And I know that one of you are still dealing with some of them at hospital, and they're very sensitive.
What is it, 20 past 12:20?
A telephone hotline set up to make contact with witnesses is already producing results.
Ready? Yep, fine, Dave. Right. Where are you off to?
See a bloke called Michael Lannion. Says here he was swept down the tunnel in a surge into the area behind the goal.
Went in about 2:30. Came back out the tunnel, stood. Here, with your foot up the post?
On the post, yeah.
Looking, obviously, towards
I went
there.
to the toilet.
You went to the toilet?
Which
Here?
is just the,
Yeah. Came back out. Saw that open for
about a minute.
about a minute.
Yeah, if that.
And some fans came in.
Yeah.
And then they closed again.
At the heart of the inquiry, a computer. Here, every statement is stored and analysed. For every statement, a name. For every name, an individual with a story to tell. Liverpool fan David Cruz was at Hillsborough. He bought his ticket at Anfield 2 weeks before the match.
Can you give me 2 ground tickets, please, love? Weeks ahead, he was looking forward to that day. See another brilliant game. Celebrate with Liverpool again.
Barry Devonside has supported Liverpool since childhood. He went to Hillsborough with his 18-year-old son, Christopher.
Everybody was excited and everybody was looking forward to a good football match by 2 first division football clubs. Christopher was looking forward to it. It was a big occasion and he was as excited as the rest of us.
Paul McCaffrey went to the match with 3 friends.
I was the last to be picked up in the car. To say we felt a bit, what would you call it, cocky or whatever, we expected to win really, I suppose. Set off about 11 o'clock. It was a lovely day.
In all, 24,000 Liverpool fans made the journey to Sheffield. No one dreamed how the day would eventually turn out for them. As fans converged on Hillsborough, South Yorkshire Police were preparing to take charge of their biggest game of the season. Sergeant John Morgan arrived at Hillsborough at 9:30. He'd policed many matches there before.
I've been a sergeant in Sheffield North Division for 10 years. I've worked hundreds of matches, I would say in excess of 150 football matches at Hillsborough.
That morning, all officers policing the match attended briefings at the ground.
I believe there were something like 800 officers on duty around the ground and inside. The main emphasis of the briefing was towards public order, I believe, rather than any suggestion that there would be any difficulty with the crowd on the terraces.
Was overcrowding as an issue mentioned at all?
No, it wasn't.
Liverpool fans approached Hillsborough along Leppings Lane. Sergeant Morgan and other officers took up their positions here at the turnstiles where the Liverpool fans would enter. 10,000 of them would then go to the Leppings Lane terraces.
The atmosphere was very pleasant. There was no hostility. People were expectant of the game. They were looking forward to a good match.
2 o'clock. Fans were already in Sheffield in large numbers.
Wanting to get there, wanting to get there and have another good day. We've seen so many games, cup games, turn out for glory for us. Beautiful day. had a good time going there. Everything just seems to be going perfectly, really.
Walking down the Halifax Road, everybody, it was just a carnival atmosphere. There was no problems at all. In fact, I remember standing there talking to the policeman on horseback, patting the horse and giving him some of my crisps, and it was just you know, up till then it was very, very good, and it was exciting.
We sat down towards the ground, set off down there. There was no trouble, nothing. Everything seemed organised and orderly. By this time we'd met up with quite a few other supporters, making their way down the hill towards Leppings Lane, and they were quite boisterous, you know, happy. Obviously some of them were tipsy, not paletic, but some of them obviously had had a drink.
The inquiry looked into press reports of mass drunkenness amongst fans, stories said to have emerged from police at the match. It concluded that the great majority were not drunk, nor even the worse for drink. All 24,000 Liverpool fans now made for the narrow bottleneck of Leppings Lane. 10,000 of them would have to go through only 7 turnstiles to get to the terraces. Fans who arrived early at the ground had no problems getting in.
Chris went into the Lepping Lane end on the terraces, and I went into the North Stand where I had a £12 stand ticket or £14 stand ticket, and that's basically how we parted. He wanted to be with all his friends behind the goal, and I wanted him to come in the stands with me, but as I say, we didn't obtain 2 tickets together, and I was in the stands and he was in the terraces.
Now, looking at his statement.
More than any other, this was a disaster which was recorded on camera. Now West Midlands Police will use this evidence to identify faces in the crowd, some who lived, others who died.
About 25 years of age. PR4, I think it is, 17. Okay. You can just take it into him again and just have a... I've got John Thomas Gall's statement. Yeah. Quite a good statement. What he says is, notice one lad in particular, about 25 years, seemed to be trapped by his legs. And it's going to be quite close to where he was standing, so... Can you get him any closer?
At the football ground, a battery of video cameras. They were operated by South Yorkshire Police and Sheffield Wednesday Football Club to monitor the behaviour and movement of crowds.
So that, together with the statements that you've got, should give us a good picture. We should be able to narrow that time down. Because obviously there's a lot of fans who made witness statements. Yeah. Not all of them are going to recall the time, but some do suggest times.
The inquiry studied 71 hours of tapes to piece together in time precisely the events of the day. What emerged was a remarkable picture of how South Yorkshire Police lost control at Hillsborough. From 2:30, their operation began to go wrong. Thousands of fans arrived in the last half hour before kick-off. The inquiry found that the football club and the police should have realised the turnstile area could not cope with this. Police planning had made no provision for it. The narrow elbow of Leppings Lane was engulfed.
When I got there, there was no form of queuing at all. You just joined the back of a group of people. The police seemed to be backing the horses away out from the crowd of people, which was causing more of a panic situation than anything. When you have a big horse stood next to you, it's very frightening.
You were lifted off your feet almost, and whichever turns, you didn't have any choice of which turnstile you went to. You were just catapulted, literally, into a turnstile and through it.
I could see a mass, a sea of people. There were cries of pain as individuals were pressed up against the turnstile gates, and I was approached by several people who grabbed hold of my clothing and shouted into my face, "There are people getting crushed out there, do something." I climbed onto the bars of one of the turnstiles and tried to assist people who were actually being crushed up against the bars, tried to pull them free, tried to reason with the people who were pushing to stand back, but it was hopeless. In a lot of cases they weren't able to do anything. They were locked in position, and even if they'd wanted to respond to that, they were unable to because of the crush behind them.
Did it seem to you that people were in danger of their lives outside those turnstiles?
Definitely. Definitely.
South Yorkshire Police were content to repeat a crowd control plan they'd used the previous year, 1988, for an identical fixture between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. But the inquiry established that in fact there were crucial differences in the policing of the two matches. The previous year, the policing was more efficient. Fans said there had been a filtering exercise around these gates between Leppings Lane and the turnstiles, the perimeter gates.
In 1988, I distinctly remember there being a line of police officers, or several police officers anyway, around the area of the perimeter gates outside Leppings Lane, checking people's tickets to ensure that only those people with tickets actually went through the perimeter gate. Now, in 1989, there was none of that whatsoever. You could just walk through the gates and join the throng of people that were there.
So opposite to last year, the fact that last year when we got there, everything seemed organised. As I say, there was policemen stopping us and asking us for our tickets. And when we did get to that same corner last year, there was actual queues and police either side of the queues organising it.
2:40, crisis in Leppings Lane. 5,000 people were now waiting to go through the turnstiles, desperate to get in before kick-off. To many fans, this was clearly impossible to achieve by 3 o'clock.
There was no way on earth that everyone was going to get through them small amounts of turnstiles in that short amount of time. And I commented to my friend that there's no way they're ever going to have to delay the kick-off to calm everybody down, because they're not going to get everyone in, really.
The Hillsborough inquiry confirmed the Liverpool fans' suspicions. It was impossible for them to get in for the kick-off. Accident investigators from the Health and Safety Executive used surveillance tape shot on the day to count the numbers of fans flowing through the turnstiles. They came to a startling conclusion. It would have taken until 3:40 for all the fans to get in.
People saw that the inability of the police was paramount. They couldn't get them into that ground in time. They weren't being told that the game was going to be delayed. They're looking at the watches and thinking, in 25 minutes, the game's going to start. We've paid £14 to get in there and we can't get in. And it's a natural feeling of frustration at that point.
In charge of policing the match was Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield. At the inquiry, the judge found Mr. Duckenfield inflexibly declined to postpone the start of the match. The judge said kick-off should have been delayed.
Had the decision been taken to delay the kick-off and a message broadcast on the tannoy system so that everyone was able to hear it, that may have had the desired effect of calming the crowd and preventing them from crushing. There was an urgency amongst the people to get into the ground at any cost.
Do you know why that didn't happen, why that announcement wasn't made?
No, I've no idea. No idea.
2:47. Fans climbed the walls to escape the crush. In the crowd, police could do little to help.
I believe that there were upwards of 50 police officers actually deployed in that area to deal with crowd reception. And in those numbers, we could not deal with 4,000 or 5,000 people crushed into a small area.
So did it seem to you that the police had lost control?
Yes, we'd lost control, yes. Yeah.
It was chaotic, to say the least. There was crushing going on outside that would have, I'm sure, resulted in fatalities if something wasn't done about it.
In the crowd, Superintendent Roger Marshall. He wanted to open the main gates, one of them Gate C, and let the fans in. Other officers agreed this was the only way to avoid deaths at the turnstiles.
I was already aware that the only way we could have admitted people to the ground without any further injuries being caused to the supporters was to open the big gates. I'd already made an independent decision in my own mind that had those gates not been opened, I was prepared to open them myself. There was no way around it.
The inquiry concluded the police were left with no alternative but to open the gates. But once through the gates, where would those fans go? That was a matter for the man in charge, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield. He was in this control box inside the ground, the nerve centre of the police operation. From here, he had commanding views of the terraces at the Leppings Lane end of the ground. He could look down into the pens where the Liverpool fans would go. 6 TV screens linked to surveillance cameras allowed him to look outside the ground at the gates on Leppings Lane, the turnstiles, and Gate C, where 5,000 fans were waiting to get in, and inside the ground at the pens, waiting to receive them. At 2:50, those pens were already full. This was obvious, even to fans some distance away. Fred Eccleston was here, on the terraces.
Looking down on the terracing below us, on the area behind the goal, the 2 pens immediately behind the goal were absolutely chock-a-block with people. They were full to capacity.
21, 22, go.
Members of the Hillsborough inquiry team packed into a tiny room to simulate conditions on the terraces.
As far as you can, sir. That's 8.2 then, per square metre.
The inquiry concluded that as thousands waited to get in, pens 3 and 4 were already full. To allow in a large stream of people was courting disaster.
Okay.
With a huge crowd clamouring at the turnstiles and the central pens already full, the police had one last option before opening the gates: to seal off the tunnel leading to the pens and divert fans elsewhere.
Would it have been possible to seal off that tunnel leading to those pens fairly easily?
Yes, it would have been. There are some gates which can be secured, and it would have been quite a simple task to put officers across the gate and also horses if necessary. Yes, it would have been quite an easy task to achieve.
If this was not done, the crowd would take the obvious route, through Gate C and down the tunnel. This would lead them to the already crowded central pens. The previous year, the tunnel had been sealed off to prevent this from happening.
The previous year, you were not allowed to go down the tunnel that led to the pens behind the goal. There was a distinctive line of police officers and stewards stopping you doing this. And they told you that you couldn't go down there because the pens were full and you had to go to another section of the ground. This year, there was nobody standing there, and you had no idea of how many people were in those pens.
The inquiry found that if orders to close the tunnel had been given, the disaster could still have been avoided. The judge said failure to give that order was a blunder of the first magnitude. 2:52. David Duckenfield gave his decision. Open the gates. 2,000 fans streamed through Gate C. Most took the obvious route, the tunnel. Now, disaster was unavoidable.
The only way to go was for the tunnel. You didn't have any choice really, that was the way you had to go. You just followed the crowd.
As we got to the end of the tunnel, he was just like sucked into the crowd. 3 or 4 steps in, and then the next thing was one almighty surge, and before we knew it, we were right at the front. Our chests pushed against one of the crash barriers. There was a lad who looked like he'd been in there for an hour, who would look like he'd fought his way up from the bottom. His face was beetroot. He was screaming, he was hitting. He hit me in the neck, screaming to let him get out of there.
As soon as we got in there, it was obvious then that it was full to capacity, and you just couldn't fit anyone else in. There was people screaming and getting crushed, falling at your feet, and everyone was picking everybody up. It was just, you just couldn't understand what was happening. You'd never experienced anything like that before at a football match.
Is there a handwritten copy?
As long as I can read it,
yeah, it should be okay.
5 weeks into the inquiry, the West Midlands police team continue to analyse eyewitness evidence of what happened at Hillsborough. The pressure is on to feed information to a public hearing in Sheffield, chaired by Lord Justice Taylor. One theme that's emerged is complaints from fans about the response of South Yorkshire Police once the crushing had begun. 2:54, 2 minutes into the disaster. As pressure in these pens grew, fans in distress called out to police guarding the fence. They wanted them to open the emergency gates onto the pitch. The inquiry found that for several minutes the police failed to recognise the problem. Vital time was lost. Then, under the intense pressure from the crowd, a gate onto the pitch sprang open. But when fans tried to escape, police at first pushed them back into the pens.
I saw the gate open 3 times, and it wasn't opened by anyone. As far as I could see, it wasn't opened by anyone. It was just the sheer pressure of people, I think, and the gate just swung open and people were trying to get out, and the policemen were just grabbing them and just putting them back in again and slamming the gate shut again.
2:58, 6 minutes into the disaster. Overlooking the pens where the fans were now being crushed, the police control box. A surveillance camera operated from there was focused on the Nottingham Forest end. Suddenly, it moved rapidly to the opposite end of the ground, the Leppings Lane terraces. The camera stopped at the edge of the crush in the central pens, then moved onto the pitch where the players were warming up. As the game kicked off, fans began to climb the fences to escape. The first to get out walked along the edge of the pitch and were shepherded by police into the emptier side pens. Then police reinforcements made for the area behind the goal, where fans continued to climb the 8-foot-high spiked fences, falling onto the running track. From a distance, Barry Devonside looked on, fears mounting for his son somewhere in the pens.
Really speaking, I was a little bit concerned about Chris's safety and the lads that he was with. And when people started clambering and climbing out of the pens, you realised that there was something wrong, maybe distress, maybe discomfort. But then when people started being pushed down off the fences and falling onto the pitch edge and onto the pathway, you knew there was something horribly wrong. People were climbing out, and you could see them even from my distance. You could see them climbing out, frightened. I couldn't actually see the looks on their face. It was their actions, their body movements, people screaming and trying to pull people out.
I jumped back down, got hold of a policeman, and he looked at the fence. He was looking at the people whose faces was jammed against the fence. By this time the fence was beveled a little bit. With the force that was the crowd, the fences started to be beveling, buckling. I grabbed him by the arm and dragged him towards the fence, and he declined. He pushed me away. I grabbed a policewoman by the arm and dragged her towards the fence. She was going backwards, away from me. I was shouting, are you going to help these people and all that? Get the fire brigade to cut the fence.
Even when police on the pitch recognised the problem, officers in command in the control box did not. They assumed they were dealing with an attempted pitch invasion. The game continued.
I suppose the first thoughts were, it's a pitch invasion, more trouble. How they didn't realise, how the penny never dropped on it. Something serious was going on is beyond me. Especially when you think the police control box was at our end of the ground.
It wasn't a pitch invasion. It didn't look like one. It didn't have the hallmarks of a pitch invasion. It was obvious that it was that the fans trying to get out and spilling out onto the pitch and the perimeter track was linked with what I could see as the very horrible overcrowding in the terrace.
I am still mystified as to how they, with their veritable battery of monitors, couldn't see what was going on in front of their eyes. If they didn't believe the monitors, then their own naked eye could tell them that there was something wrong in those pens. I find that very difficult to come to terms with the professional people. Could be so blind.
3:03. Still the game continued. Near the front of the pens, youngsters were weakened to the point of collapse and in some cases, death.
Somebody shouted and there was people dying at the front. I just remember hearing that and thinking, could it be happening?
You could smell vomit then. Sweat and like a funny feeling of variance around you. You know, when you feel that it's panicking now. You know, you've got to get out of there.
He was only a young lad, in his early teens, I think. He had a white shirt on. Had him by his collar. Just had hold of him by his collar. You couldn't really get hold of anywhere else. It was his hair or his collar, because by this time, I don't even know if he was conscious. I had hold of his collar, and I think somebody else had hold of his shirt, his sleeve, and we were trying to pull him up to get him to stand up, just even chest height. And then, as I say, the surge just took him away from us. He was just pulled out of our hands.
It was still only 4 minutes past 3. the full horror of the disaster was yet to come. In the pens, pressure was at crisis point. The inquiry analysed this moment, counting every person in pen 3. Their conclusion: there were 500 people too many.
The density of the crowd was far greater at the front portion, and this is clear from anybody's observation of the photograph of pen 3 taken just after the kick-off, something like 3 minutes past or 4 minutes past 3. We were able to calculate an estimate of the people in pen 3 at that time, which was some 1,576, which was 50% in excess of what it should have been.
Only the crush barriers held the crowd back. Then there was another surge.
The barrier snapped, and anyone that was immediately against the barrier just fell forward onto us. The barrier hit me on the back of my left leg. People just went over then, and they were just grabbing at whatever they could. I could feel my hair getting pulled, grabbing at his shirt, and people's hands on my legs, trying to pull themselves up. And then you just feel the hand letting go. All you could feel was other people's limbs, arms, legs, maybe bodies underneath you. You were doing your best to keep your feet off, but you've got to imagine you can't even look down to see where you're putting your feet. You could only feel for the concrete and do your best not to stand on anybody and hurt them.
3:05, the match was stopped. More police arrived on the pitch in answer to a call from officers in command, who continued to believe this was a pitch invasion. Sergeant John Morgan was still on duty near the turnstiles.
Suddenly I heard a message being passed over the radio to the effect that all available officers were to go to the track because the fans were invading the pitch.
Tapes of police radio messages were analysed by the inquiry team. They confirmed that even at this stage, Chief Superintendent Duckenfield was still mainly concerned about public order. He called for dog handlers and all other available police to come to the ground.
What greeted me when I reached that position, I will never forget so long as I live, because there were people being pressed up against the fence. The faces were blue, the tongues were lolling out of the mouths, there was mucus and blood, arms pressed up against the fence, cyanosed, blue. They were being pressed up against the netting, and it was bulging under the pressure, under the weight. And they were being, obviously, maintained in an upright position. Although I believe that some of them may already have been dead at that stage. It was a devastating thing to see. There were officers tending injured people. I could see people climbing backwards into the west stand, being hauled upwards by the people who were up there. People climbing over the fence onto the track. It was an amazing sight.
Then, an officer on the pitch radioed for a fleet of ambulances. In the control box, only now did David Duckenfield realise the gravity of the situation. Fans who had escaped the pens climbed back onto the fence to try and pull out others who were still trapped. One of those on the fence was Brian Doyle.
I jumped up onto the fence and leaned over. I was grabbing people's hands to try and drag them up. But it was hopeless. It was like they were stuck together. Or they was... most of them couldn't move their arms, couldn't lift their arms up. She was just screaming for help. I was screaming to them, just get back and all that. There's people getting crushed, there's, you know,
They knew. They was all screaming back to me. I could hear it. We can't move anywhere. There's no one move. We can't go back, we can't go forward. I got hold of some woman's hand. Like, more than anything, I wanted to get her out. She just let go of my hands. The feelings, the strength of her hands went. Whether she gave up or through shock, I don't know. It's the feeling of watching the life and the colour of someone just going out of them, and you can't do nothing about it. Helplessness, and anger. There was a lot of anger. I would have gladly changed my place for that woman that day. It's when you have hold of someone, you know, alive, and you can feel the life draining out of them, then it does something to you.
Quite quickly, I decided that the best thing for me to do would be to go around to the tunnel. And I called to a number of officers who were standing at the edge of the pitch for them to join me. I asked them to follow me. I started to go down into pen 3, pushing people back, grabbing hold of them and pushing them back down the tunnel behind me. And I was followed down the terrace by other officers. I worked my way down to the front of the terrace, again to be confronted by a horrific sight, which I shall never forget, which I think about every day. A pile of bodies crushed up against the wall, waist deep.
The lad had to pull me out backwards over the bodies. You couldn't move your legs by then. I was dragged out from behind, as I say, as were other people that were where we were standing. Once I was free, I turned and started to do the same for other people. Once you could see how many people were on the floor, it was unbelievable. As if someone had let a bomb off, the amount of people that were there on the floor. You wouldn't have thought they'd just been crushed. By this time there was 1 or 2 policemen on the terraces. Some of them were reviving people, others were standing around. They looked bewildered, lost. Helpless, I suppose, and shocked. Just carried on taking people out then. The ones that were dead we just put to one side. And the ones that were alive, other people were taken out onto the pitch. I mean, it was one thing seeing men die there, but young kids and girls. Shouldn't happen, should he?
3:15. Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield stayed in the police box. According to Lord Justice Taylor, Mr. Duckenfield's capacity to take decisions and give orders seems to have collapsed. In the words of the judge, he froze. This would explain why, when seen by Graham Kelly of the FA, he gave an untrue account of what had happened, blaming the fans.
Chief Superintendent Duckenfield gave an order at 10 to 3, or thereabouts, to open the gates. At 3:15, when he's approached by officials from the Football Association, Mr. Kelly and Mr. Curtin, he allows them to leave his police control box with the impression, if not more, that the gates had been kicked open by football supporters. Mr. Kelly then goes on nationwide TV and says, well, there's two theories. It's the fans' theory and the police theory. Mr. Duckenfield, some 6, 7, 8 weeks later in the witness box, makes a public apology that if he did say what it's alleged he said, then it wasn't true.
On the pitch, many fans and police officers were now doing all they could to revive the victims.
Looked like there'd been a war. The penalty area was just littered with people lying on the floor. All you could see was people getting their chests hit.
The bodies were laid on the grass to be tended by firemen and St John's ambulance personnel, and I assisted them to do that. I think I carried 2 or 3 bodies by that means to that end of the ground.
It dawned upon you the seriousness of what was going on. 6 or 7 lads carrying somebody on a hoarding with their arm just flopping up and down, and you're saying to yourself, that fella's dead. What the hell's going on here? There was people lying on the pitch. There was a coldness, a literally coldness in the stands. I was frozen with fear because I was worried about Christopher. It went on. I stayed there, I think, till about 4:15. I'd seen sights at that game that no person should see or should be involved in. I walked out with thousands of people, and it was like attending a funeral as we walked out the stand. There were just ambulances, police cars, fire engines jammed together within about 20 feet of the gate. As I walked up the Lepping Lane, and all I wanted to do was to see sight of Chris. Unfortunately, I got halfway up to the point where we'd arranged to meet, and Chris wasn't there, and I was given the news by Jason that Chris was seriously injured. He then told me in a second breath that Chris had died. I didn't believe it for a minute. I refused to accept it. I then went over to a police lady and asked her would she escort me back to the ground, as I'd just been given the news that my son had died. From then on, I would say I had sheer 5 hours of hell.
Barry Devonside spent those 5 hours looking for his son, Chris. He finally identified his body that night in the gym at the football ground, which had been used as a makeshift mortuary. The West Midlands Police Inquiry Team have continued to investigate the disaster at Hillsborough.
Stuart, some actions for you. Yes, sir. I'll just draw your attention to this paragraph here on the action. It's to try and obtain an up-to-date photograph of the deceased. There's probably no need to tell you. But it's on the action nevertheless, a sensitive approach.
There will be an inquest into 95 deaths and the possibility of civil and criminal proceedings.
always think of them people on that day. You hope maybe one day be able to put it behind you. But in another way, you don't want to forget them people who were stood next to you.
There's people saying a lot of the senior officers are broken men. Well, there's a lot of broken families in it.
I think I'll never forget what happened to other people, the ones that didn't come back. I'll never forgive people, and I'll never forget it for what went on that day.
In his report, Lord Justice Taylor said that although there were other causes, the main reason for the disaster was the failure of control by South Yorkshire Police. At the inquiry, their case had been to blame the fans and the club, but the judge concluded such an unrealistic approach gives cause for anxiety as to whether lessons have been learnt.
People distressed or worried in any way as a result of the disaster at Hillsborough can ring a helpline number in Liverpool. It's 051 225 3413 and 3414, and it's available 24 hours a day. That's all from us until March. Good night.